First of all, thanks to Freelancer for having us here. Alec and Adam over there. Alec, who's just speaking, have been great in helping us get this space. Today's a collaborative event, so make sure you're asking questions towards the end. Both Roisin and Dan are going to be talking about diversity today, which is a topic very close to Precision's heart. We've been running diversity events for the last couple of years now within the tech industry. So the fact that you guys are here is testament to the fact that you want to actually change that and hopefully change it in your teams or in your company as well. So it's Ksenia's event, so I'm not going to take up much time, but first of all, the toilets, for anyone who hasn't been yet, are out the front door to the left down the hallway. Emergency exits over there and over there. And we'll probably go to the pub at the end as well if everyone wants to join us, so just remember that. But I'll pass you to Ksenia, who'll open up for us now.
So thank you guys for coming in here. I'm really excited to see some familiar faces from the last events, and it means that you guys are genuinely interested in the topics that we're discussing and are active participants in the community. I also am really happy to see some new faces, which means there's you guys are spreading the word and the community is growing. So I just wanted to give you a bit of a background of why we decided to focus this event on diversity, because the last two events were focused on quite different topics of how to assess your team's performance, how to scale effectively. This one is quite a different one, and it basically came to a fact that at the last event I looked around the room and I realized that 85% of the visitors were middle-aged white men. So I came up to my boss, Simon, and said, Simon, I know that we are hosting Women in Data, which is the event that is targeting the audience to promote diversity in the workplace. But at the same time, this is the events for leaders in the IT space. So people who can actually influence and change something in the IT workforce of Sydney and Australia for some of you. So I thought it would be a good platform to deliver the message about diversity and inclusion. I have two brilliant speakers over there, Dan and Roisin, helping me to deliver that message. So I actually met Dan at one of the other meetups, and he was talking about the problems that Expert360 encountered when they started scaling and how he tackled them early by simply changing his recruitment strategy and his interviewing process. And now, correct me if I'm wrong, your team is 40% women? About 35% of women in technical positions. And you probably know Roisin as the big advocate for women in technology and big advocate for girls in STEM subjects. She actually recently started a meetup for women CTOs. So if you know of any who would be interested in participating in the conversations that they're having, please reach out to Roisin, let her know. And she's going to be talking about inclusion in the workplace, because diversity goes beyond gender. Gender is an obvious topic, but it goes beyond race, beyond culture, beyond everything. And before asking a question of, are we building a diverse team, you need to ask a question, does everybody in my team feel included? Does everybody in my team feel supported? And how do I structure my teams in a way that nobody actually feels excluded from the conversation? So please give a big round of applause to our speakers. And I'm going to pass the word to Dan, and hopefully you can learn some new tips and tricks from him in terms of your recruitment process and implement them in your teams.
Cool. Thanks, Ksenia. Which one am I using, guys? Top. Cool. Cool. Thanks for everyone coming along this afternoon. It's Friday afternoon, and it's probably been a big week for most of you. It's certainly been a big week for me, so I hope you've still got some capacity left to absorb some of these concepts. But I've got to say, first and foremost, some of you may be wondering, I see a few faces a little bit like my own are in the audience, some different, but why is a white guy, not quite middle-aged yet, but on the way, talking about diversity? Well, when I first started as an engineer, I've got a clicker, thank you. When I first started as an engineer, back in '99, when I studied engineering, there's a team or a class, in engineering in my first year of like 300, and I think there were 3 girls, women, I should say. Back in those days, I probably didn't think that much about it, but I did wonder why. And then as I've gone through my career, I started to realize, well, actually, I wonder if some of the reason that I have been successful in my career is just because I'm white and male. Maybe that's part of it. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say for sure, but certainly acknowledging some of the privilege that may have given me a bit of a head start or a bit of a leg up on others is a really important part in this. And I think people with privilege, people that maybe are less privileged, everybody has an opportunity to do something about improving diversity and inclusion and giving everybody an opportunity. So I think I describe it as diversity being an everyone problem, not just those that may be in a minority or be perhaps even being persecuted. So that's why. So let me share with you a little bit of a journey that I've gone on at Expert360. I joined the business as the VP of Engineering just over, well, nearly up to 18 months ago. So it's been a really eye-opening experience. I've actually been exploring this topic for quite a while, but certainly having to hire quite aggressively in a tech startup has given me a few new perspectives on things. So firstly, why is diversity important? I'm hoping that some of these answers will be obvious, but maybe not. So let's go through a couple of the maybe more, I guess, unexpected reasons. So if you think about the technology industry as a whole, probably if you've tried to hire engineers or if you've maybe been in recruitment like Precision, you probably know that there's a bit of a skills shortage in tech. Sometimes it can be really hard to find the right people. But actually there's, of that whole pool of candidates of the workforce in general, only about 26% of them are female. So just by pure numbers, if you think about whether you were to increase the number of women participating in the workforce, in the technology workforce, then that's increasing your talent pool. So there's a really simple reason why this is good. There's a growing number of I think, in particular young girls that are finding technology and STEM interesting. And certainly contrast that to maybe 20, 30 years ago, it's come a long way. So I think over the next 10 or 15 years, we'll probably see a big shift in the participation. Another reason, this is a study from McKinsey in 2015, companies in the top quartile for gender diversity were 15% more likely to have returns above the industry mean. So what that's saying is basically that companies that have diverse teams actually perform better, actually earn more money, or whatever their particular performance metric is, they actually do better. And why is that? Well, homogeneous teams, that is, teams where everybody's pretty much the same, they feel easier. But sometimes easy is bad for performance. This comes down to this idea of a fluency heuristic. So the fluency heuristic tells us that when we all agree on something and we're not debating something constantly, we don't have arguments about an outcome or an idea, that sort of this tendency to think that that must be the right outcome. But that's actually not necessarily the case. And the key here is diversity of thought. Diversity can come in many forms. We're talking a lot about gender diversity today. Of course, when you're talking about gender, you can mean many different things. You can talk about cultural or ethnic diversity. You can talk about somebody's abilities or disabilities. Certainly gender is the one we often talk about. But diversity of thought is actually one of the major reasons why diverse teams perform better. Because you may not necessarily all have the same opinion about how something should be done. And so then that encourages you to have a debate, and it means that you might actually get a better outcome. And then does that diverse team, or think about it another way, does that homogeneous team actually represent your audience? If you're a company selling a product, do you have members of your team that actually reflect the users of your product? I mean, it's probably pretty unusual, in my view, that a company would sell a product just to one very specific group of people. I mean, sure, it happens, but most companies have a wide range of users or a wide range of customers. And so how can you build empathy for that wide range of users if you don't have those people who identify with those particular groups in your teams? So let's go back to Expert360. 18 months ago, we had just nine people in our product and engineering team, so quite small. It's a very fast-growing company. And we had 22%, so 2 out of 9 of the members in that team identified as female, which is just below the industry average. So it was okay, nothing particularly wrong, but I was conscious that as we started to grow, I wanted to make sure we gave plenty of people the opportunities to join us and come and work for us, and that meant changing some of the ways that we thought about our teams and how we hired. So part one that I wanted to think about, messaging. What is the message that you're sending to the market, to your candidate pool? And this is probably a message that gets sent quite a lot by engineering teams. Ninjas or rock stars, guns or gurus. Hands up anyone who's ever seen a job ad that said, insert language ninja or insert language gun. Everywhere, right? So we started to think about what message that was sending our particular, our potential candidate pool. So instead, I started thinking, and I worked very closely with the recruitment team and the engineering team. We want curious, passionate, and smart developers. Now, notice that this is not, this is about what people feel and what they identify with, not necessarily some label that we're assigning. It meant that people started to feel more inclined to be a part of this business. It means that we're not kind of giving people an opportunity to self-select out because they don't necessarily feel that they're at that level. And this extended to our job ads. So this is not this is not verbatim a job ad that we ran, but it's sort of an indication of the kinds of job ads that you may see in the market. So, and look at the wording here. So a software developer must know HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, at least 5 years of Ruby or Python, in-depth knowledge of SQL and RDBMS. And you also notice that all of these terms, they're quite specific. So they're saying you've got to have these particular things, or we don't even want to talk to you. That's sort of the message that you're putting forward. So how are people going to respond to that message? How anyone from any different group, how are they going to internalize, the expectation that they think we have on them? So put that another way, the wording is really important here. So if you have worked with any of the below, we'd love to hear from you. The thing about software development and the industry as a whole is that there are lots and lots and lots and lots of things to know. Like every day there's a new framework or technology or something. And if I'm extremely specific about what I expect my potential employees to know about, then if they judge themselves based on those exact requirements, then those people will feel less inclined to apply. And actually, while it's not a hard and fast rule, it has been shown, some studies have shown that women tend, not always, but tend to self-select out if they don't have all of the boxes checked, whereas men are much more likely to self-select in, even if they only have a handful. Basically, men are more egotistical, but we all knew that, right? So this is another example. This one is a Ruby on Rails Ninja job ad. It wasn't one of ours. We took it from a job ad site somewhere. And actually, I've put this through a tool called Textio. So Textio will start to do some analysis on the language, the tone, the gender tone even of that language, but also start to identify where I can make some changes. So you can see this one here scored only 32 out of a possible 100. This was one of our first job ads we ran at Expert360 when I started, and this one's a little better, but still not great. You notice that the tone is somewhat feminine, but there are still a number of issues. Note that also feminine tone isn't the only thing to be aware of here. It's more about making sure that people feel comfortable in applying to the role. And this was the one we ran, this was a little while ago now, but this was sort of the third iteration of those job ads, and this one scored much better. So I encourage you to check out Textio if you haven't already. There's a free version and a paid version, and very, very useful if you're writing job ads. I mean, any discipline really. I think Textio specialises in engineering, but I think these kinds of ideas apply. Anyway, so the next thing that somebody does after they apply or click a job ad, say, might go and have a look at your careers page. Anyone tell me what's wrong with this careers page? Claire? Exactly. I hope that's really obvious to everybody in the room. The funny thing about cognitive bias is you may not necessarily even realise. I'm not going to pick on the company. They're actually a great company, but they've got a few diversity issues. This was an image on their careers page. I even tweeted them about it and said, hey guys, you want to put at least one woman on your careers page? And they said, oh yeah, we've got plenty of women. And then careers page is still the same 2 years later. But this sends a really important message to potential candidates. Another example is, it comes at it from a very different perspective, is Melbourne-based Envato. Envato are, if you're in the tech scene, you've probably heard of them. They're a very successful privately owned business. They have a big team, remote team, and on-site team. And their careers page, I think, is one of the best examples you'll see. It doesn't give you a really specific view of the kinds of people they want. Instead, it's quite open. They do have images of people, but they're cartoons, so they're not, they're not too specific. But they've got a man and a woman, and they're quite neutral in their language. So, in my view, that's quite open and broadly appealing. And certainly that would be supported. The evidence supports that in terms of their team makeup. They have a very diverse team. So we tried something similar for the Expert360 job site. I'm not claiming that ours is as good as Envato's, but we made some pretty massive changes after doing some research, and we had quite an increase in the amount of click-throughs from that site. And when you're looking at what appeals to people about a business, you might think about, well, what are the perks? And in Silicon Valley, you're not a real startup if you don't have beer pong and table tennis, right? That's how you get your rock stars and ninjas. But actually, that's not culture. I mean, it is a perk. But if you change the way that you think about what is appealing to people to work in your company, then it can become cultural more than a perk. So think, for example, what are the team events that we run, and how do we think about our team events? Do we offer flexible working? Do we have paid parental leave? Those kinds of things. Another thing that we started doing at Expert360 is being a part of the community. So one of the programming languages that we use at Expert360 is called Elixir. So this was an event we sponsored last year called Elixir Girls. So modeled after the very popular Rails Girls, which has been running for a number of years. We had some of our team mentor and coach people who were interested in getting into Elixir, primarily women. Men were welcome, of course, but we were putting the emphasis on women that day. And we had some really enthusiastic attendees, and even actually made a hire. And if you don't necessarily do all your recruiting yourself and you use a recruiter, that's totally cool. And in fact, there's a great one hosting the event today in Precision. But why not try asking your recruiter for a mixed shortlist? Put the onus on them to help you in this journey as well. But most importantly, measure. Measure how you're proceeding, how your activities are actually impacting you. And so these are some of our stats over the last 12 months. You have a look at the number of applicants in our job queue that identified as female. At the software tech lead level, it's a more senior role, so unfortunately there are fewer women, I guess, in the market in general, so we had a lower rate, 11%. But if you go down to the junior developer, we had up to 33. So that's sort of indicative that there are more women entering the space, which is really encouraging. However, you compare that to the application rate to the hire rate, and women actually do a lot better, more than 4 times better. So men are only getting a 3% hire rate. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, is this favoritism? Are you hiring women because you have a preconceived idea that you're trying to hire women? We try very, very hard to avoid that. We have quite strict and consistent hiring practices and interviewing practices. Actually, the research indicates that this number is higher because women tend only to apply when they actually are feeling much, much more confident than men. And it takes women longer or more. Requires fewer barriers for them to. Let me try again. Sorry. It takes men fewer barriers to apply, to feel confident in applying, than women. So women actually have a better chance of success when they do. Interviewing, part number 2. I'll try and push through this because we're at limited time. Most important thing, focus on behavioural before technical. As engineers, if you're hiring engineers, you may be tempted to think more about hiring for technical, but actually it's much easier to coach somebody up technically than it is behaviourally. If you've got someone who's got terrible behaviour but they're a great engineer, that's actually much harder to deal with. So focus on the behavioural first. And when you're looking at behavioural, you've got to understand how you want to gather evidence in the responses that you get from people. So some common ones, use situational, sometimes called STAR questions. So given a situation, please tell me what actions you took and what were the results. So it's a real situation. Ask the same questions, be consistent. And actually, that's really important. You've got to ask the same questions for every candidate, as kind of tedious as that seems, because otherwise you have no basis for comparison. Identify core behaviours that you want to assess. And some of the ones that we think about at Expert360, can the candidate think on their feet? Can they deal with pressure, willingness? Do they have a willingness to admit that they're wrong? That kind of stuff. And that's a really, really important set of behaviours. Use data, obviously, and also get feedback from new starters, which sometimes can get missed. You get so excited about bringing a new person into the business that you forget to ask them, well, actually, what was the process like to come into the new business? The biggest challenge in interviewing is cognitive bias. You've probably heard this term. The human mind is pretty flawed, really. It's easy for us to think that it's not, but actually there's all sorts of issues or mistakes all of us make on a day-to-day basis. This is sort of an image I found on the net about common ones. I'm by no means an expert in cognitive bias. I'm not going to go through this in detail. If you want to learn more about cognitive bias, I recommend Emma Jones. She's got a cognitive bias training workshop. I'll share a link at the end. But I'll just share with you quickly a couple of the common ones. So men tend to boast more than women. And women tend to downplay their experience. These are all tendencies, not hard and fast rules, of course, but make sure you ask your female candidates more about their accomplishments. Common cognitive bias is for particularly men, but also women, to judge men on their potential and women on what they've actually accomplished. So make sure that you can assess potential and achievements separately and don't unfairly select men over women, or vice versa for that matter. Another one you might have seen before is the idea that just because you like somebody doesn't mean they're competent. It's a very easy trap to fall into. You can build a nice rapport with somebody and you think, oh, they're going to be great, but actually, have you tested their competence in the role? And the last one is one of my favorite, ideas, is how often have you heard somebody say, oh, this person isn't a cultural fit? But is culture fit actually what you're looking for? If you've got a culture that's maybe not where you want it to be, maybe that's not such a good thing. So try to think about culture as an add rather than as a fit. Most importantly, you can't get rid of your biases, but you can work around them. So lastly, work culture. I think Roisin's going to talk more about this in a moment, but I'll just touch on a few ideas. I think inclusion is one of the most important things you can work on in a business. In fact, there was a study by Harvard Business School, I think 2014, that said up to 50% of women in technology will leave their technology role at some point. And that's not, to go on maternity leave or something like that. This is a career change because they've had enough. So that's pretty disappointing. So inclusion is stuff like, don't just invite the blokes to lunch, don't go to the pub necessarily. I mean, some people like to go to the pub, that's fine. But do things where you think that everybody can actually be a part of it. Everyone can feel like they belong. So we actually went lawn bowl playing last year as a team, and it was great fun. And then a few people had a couple of drinks, and others that didn't drink felt perfectly happy with that arrangement. So they would, the drinkers would go inside, and the others would stay out on the green. Be flexible for both women and men. So probably lots of you have thought about working from home policies or remote policies. They are actually really, really powerful in encouraging diversity in your workplace. For example, 90%, a recent study showed that 90% of the care given to children under 15 is still done by mothers. Very little of it is done by men, but there is a sense or almost an expectation that the man or the father, and I'm talking of course in heterosexual couples, it's only one viewpoint, but if you're a dad and you're staying at work and your partner is staying at home looking after the child, then A, your partner is no longer probably able to work, and B, that's just kind of unfair, right? So having flexible work policies might allow for a split parenting. It might allow mums to continue working. It gives people options. And we have, at Expert360, we actually have a couple of new mums or relatively new mums, and they both work part-time. And they're able to continue to build their careers, and we find a working arrangement that works for them. Team structures are actually really important. I'm going to share a quick problem with you. So let's imagine you've got two teams in a development organization. It's all men, and you hire two women. Do you put those two women in the same team or in different teams? Common answer is probably I'm going to put one woman in this team and one woman in this team. But the problem is, I see some shaking heads, I'm glad you're all thinking about this already. The problem is that now you're making those women a minority in those teams. So sometimes that's okay. I encourage you to have conversations with the members of your teams and make sure you understand what will make them feel comfortable and what's going to work well for them. But quite often, it's actually if you've just got two women in the team, put them together. So then they've got some moral support. Lastly, don't be a creep. I almost took this slide out of my talk, but then I thought about it. If we'd solved this problem, we wouldn't have stuff like Me Too. We wouldn't have Susan Fowler coming out and writing a blog post about her experiences at Uber. We wouldn't have all the crap that's gone down at Google. So I'm going to leave it in there. Guys, I really hope that you all know what this means. And if you do know what this means, but you see other guys doing it, call them out on it. Don't let that stuff slide, because standing and letting it happen is pretty much as bad as doing it yourself. And I wanted to share, if you're an engineer, maybe you'll appreciate this, just a kind of a lame little slide about the rules that you might follow if you're not sure about how to work or act in the workplace. Anyway, that's just a tongue-in-cheek. So let's come back to Expert360. A year and a bit on, and we've now hired, we're up to 23 engineers. We actually have a pretty low churn rate. I've only had a couple of people leave over the last year. And we now have 35% women or female participation or non-male participation. I should mention, I don't necessarily believe that things like this have to be 50-50. It's not about making sure that there's always equal participation in your particular team. I mean, there aren't as many female engineers in the workforce, so that's probably unrealistic. And I certainly don't advocate favoritism. But I do advocate very strongly for you all encouraging more women to be a part of the process and then hire on merit once they're in that process. So anyway, that's my journey at Expert360, and I appreciate the time. And here's some resources for you, so thank you. Cheers. Do you want to do question and answer or at the end? Or?
Questions for later.
Okay.
We're going to have a very interactive discussion with the audience, and both you and Roisin. I just actually quickly, I don't know if I need a microphone, to be honest. Can you hear me all right? Yeah. I'm fairly loud. I actually just wanted to get to the topic of interviewing women. What recently happened at Precision Source, and Leisha, that's just sitting there in the front in a yellow t-shirt, had to babysit a kid of one of her candidates while she was going in an interview. It was quite a funny and a bit of a stressful experience for her. But I basically wanted to make a point that sometimes you don't even think about how hard it can be for some people to even go to an interview and actually take the time out of their day, because we don't have, half of us are experts here, so we don't really have relatives who can take care of the kids, and daycare is really expensive. So by thinking of that, and maybe having even a childcare room where you can just leave your kid while you're interviewing, it would help more women to actually get back into the workforce. And as this, I recently discussed on LinkedIn, a lot of companies are starting to get return to work programs. It's basically an internship, and Roisin actually told me about those ones. An internship for women coming back from maternity leave, and it's 14 weeks of intensive work experience, after which they can actually be up to date with their skill set and apply to jobs more confidently, and maybe even stay at that place that provided them an internship. So I think it's a very important topic, and there are a lot of minor things that we can change that will actually make a big impact in the long run. So thank you very much, Dan. So please give Dan another round of applause.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Now, okay. Oh, perfect. Okay, I can hear myself. Okay, awesome. So, Thank you very much. I am going to refer to my notes because I've been looking at some studies and I'm never going to remember the names and the dates and everything, so I'm going to actually refer to my notes as I go through this. So funnily enough, as a CTO who also happens to be female, I get asked a lot about diversity. So after a few weeks and months of this, when I first joined Gumtree, I decided I'd better do some research and actually have an opinion one way or the other on what it actually was and what it meant to me. So I've taken some of the learnings from my research over the last few months, but also from my own experience over the last 20 years, from both being an engineer and being in technology leadership positions, both in Ireland and Australia. So go on to the next one. Good. So who am I? So my name is Roisin Parkes, and don't worry if you can't pronounce it. Nobody can pronounce it. It's one of those funny Irish names. Everyone gets it wrong, even in Ireland, so don't worry too much about it. So I obviously come from Ireland, you can tell from my accent, but I have spent about 20 years in the industry working in both Ireland and Australia, but actually with teams all over the world. So I spent a lot of time in Europe and in the US as well. I grew up in a very techie family. My dad was an engineer. My mum studied information technology and telecommunications as well at university. And so we always had computers available in our house when I was young, which was very unusual back in those days. I won't tell you how old I was, but I started learning to code when I was 9 years old. Even then, it was just kind of a toy, something to play with. I didn't really think about it as a career until I actually went to university to study computer systems and did a nine-month work placement. And at my 9-month work placement, I was working for a very, very small company who didn't have a lot of resources. So basically, I was it. So I had to do everything. So I would literally drive out to the customers, get their requirements, take all the requirements back to the office, write up the requirements document, do the design, do all of the development, all of the testing, package it up, drive back out to their houses, install it on their machines, train them up on the system, and then get any of the feedback and defects back from it, which was awesome for me because a lot of my classmates went to work for awesome big companies like Microsoft and IBM and never wrote a line of code. So I felt like I had a huge advantage, but more than that, it gave me a real passion for technology because I could see how it changed people's lives. And that passion, I think, took me through a lot of my career when there was plenty of reasons to leave. Last year, I attended an event called Vogue Codes in Sydney. I don't know if any of you attended, but it's this conference that's basically aimed at encouraging more women to get into coding. And there was an awesome speaker there. Her name was Anastasia Camerato. I don't know, again, if any of you know her, but she's a CIO that works at for Westpac Consumer Group. And she's a very successful CIO, but what she said really resonated with me, which was when I was in my 20s, I didn't think it was unusual to work in a team with all men. When I was in my 30s, I was very busy having children. And when I was in my 40s, I got to a point where I looked around and went, where the hell are all the women gone? And so I kind of went, oh, wow, that was basically my experience as well. So most of my 20s working mostly with men. But not just working mostly with men, I saw a lot of the women that I worked with leave the industry in their 20s. So long before they were considering getting married or having kids, there was something happening in their workplace that was driving them away from technology careers. But not only that, even within technology, if they stayed within the company, they moved to less technical roles. So QA roles, business analyst roles, project management roles. And I never really figured out why that was happening, or it didn't kind of seem to me to be, I couldn't figure it out. One of the things that's kind of struck me as well in my 40s is that the technology industry is incredibly accessible for people, especially for women. It's not like you need a whole load of strength to lift bricks upstairs, or, you're not working with dangerous individuals. Well, most of the time you're not working with dangerous individuals. But there shouldn't be any kind of physical barriers for women to work in tech. Like, it's one of the most flexible kind of careers that you can have. People can work from home. People don't necessarily need to be in a certain place for certain hours. So given that level of kind of flexibility and accessibility, it feels like it's wrong that there aren't more women in the industry. So I'm going to quickly look at a definition of diversity, but I know Dan has deep dived on this a little bit. So Williams and O'Reilly actually define it as any attribute that another person may use to detect individual differences. The dictionary definition is this one: difference, variation, and unlikeness. It's quite a broad definition, and when you actually start deep diving into how we can use diversity to drive high performance in teams, we actually need to get to a much finer level of granularity as to what exactly it is. I'm going to quickly also look at inclusion. So the dictionary definition of an inclusion is the action or state of being included, or of being included within a group or a structure. So you could argue that inclusion is more about acceptance, being heard, being respected in spite of or because of your actual diversity. And diversity and inclusion are kind of being discussed much more together, which I think is a great thing, because it moves the diversity problem away from being something that your HR manager looks after, and much more about something that you as a technology leader need to drive within your teams. Okay, so again, just looking at the stats, this is a terrible slide because I couldn't get this all onto one slide. There's lots of information here, so I definitely encourage you to go and look at the actual infographic directly. So you might look at this and think, oh, that's not actually too bad. Facebook is 33% women, Flickr's 37%, eBay is about 43% women. And you think, oh, well, where's the problem? But this doesn't actually tell the full story. And when you start looking at technical roles, you find that the numbers are a lot different. Technical roles, women in senior leadership positions and things like that. So what's the big deal? I think Dan has gone into this in enough detail, so I won't talk about it again, but he mentioned these two reports, the McKinsey report and the Credit Suisse Research Institute, which both have shown that diversity can impact the performance of the company in a positive way. But there's been some other studies as well that almost seem to contradict that. So there was a big study done by Google, and there was a New York Times article on this a couple of years ago. And the project that they ran at Google was a project called Project Aristotle. Has anyone heard about this project? So they surveyed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of teams within their organization. As you can imagine, there's quite a large number of teams within Google. And so what they actually discovered was that the structure of the team has very little impact on whether or not that team is high performing. And that included diversity, or it doesn't necessarily lead to a high performing team. So we're going to talk about that in a little while. So again, Dan touched on this, but why does diversity actually work? Diversity works because it makes us feel uncomfortable. And it's that very feeling of discomfort that actually drives some of the thinking and rethinking and kind of examination of facts, re-examination of facts, that actually leads to better outcomes for our teams. So there was an experiment done on tenure diversity a few years ago. So they had 3 old-timers, that's the way they phrase them, not my words, in several different groups. And they were gathered to decide who was the most likely murder suspect in a series of tests. And so 5 minutes into their discussion, a newcomer joined some of the groups. And so this newcomer expressed opinions of their own as to who the subject was. So it turned out that the groups with the newcomer were far less confident in their joint decision, but they were far more likely to guess correctly who the murderer was. So having that somebody in your team to second guess your decisions can actually drive you to the right outcomes. So scientists think that diverse teams may outperform homogeneous ones in decision-making because they process the information much more carefully. So what are the different types of diversity then? So these are kind of the three main areas. Again, this was another study done in 1999. And they looked at three different types of diversity. Social category diversity, which is kind of the explicit diversity, which is the one that you kind of most associate. So gender, age, race, that kind of thing. And then there's informational diversity, which is, cross-functional teams, people with different kind of educational backgrounds. And then there's value diversity, which is in things like religious beliefs, political beliefs, but also organizational values as well can actually be included in here. So those three different types of diversity actually have a different impact on your teams. So what these studies found is that informational diversity increased task conflict, and that's the diversity of thought that Dan mentioned earlier. And as we've already seen, that positively impacts performance. But social category diversity actually positively influenced the team's morale. And value diversity was the one that most decreased team member satisfaction, intent to remain and commitment in the group. And those two last phrases are actually quite important. Intent to remain and commitment to the group. And that's where inclusion comes in. If your team members have a low intent to remain and commitment to the group, that's what drives them out. So keeping those two things up are actually what can help you retain your talent. So, another model put forward in 1987 actually argues that organizations naturally evolve towards a state of homogeneity through a process of attraction, selection, and attrition. So if you've got a team that is made up of, 10 middle-aged white men, they are far more likely to hire more middle-aged white men, promote middle-aged white men, and keep all the members of their team. And so you really need to think about that when you're actually trying to hire, for example, and it's much easier to hire into an already diverse team than it is to change the homogeneity of an existing team. Okay. So, creating a diverse team is easy. Not necessarily so, but actually creating a high-performing, happy, diverse team is incredibly difficult to do. Well, not incredibly difficult. It can be done, but it is a lot harder. A lot of diversity programs are unfortunately focused on recruitment, but once you get those people into your team, how do you actually hold on to them, and does it actually matter? I give an example. Let's say in an ideal scenario, you just had 100 new developers turn up, which would be awesome for any team. And let's say 90% of them were men and you had 10 women. And this goes right back to what Dan said earlier. Where do you place those women? It actually is very important how you actually structure your teams. So I'm going to skip past a little bit of this. This is what Dan talked about earlier. You could put, yeah. It's this. Because I keep adjusting this. Is it that one? Yeah. All right, can you hear me? Okay, good. All right, so where was I? Oh yes, so we're going to skip through this one. So there was a very interesting study done back in, of all years, 1977, which actually showed that how you structure your teams is incredibly important for keeping diversity in your teams. So actually, the way you structure your teams can better dictate the outcomes when it comes to higher performance and keeping your diverse talent. So she talked about 4 different groups: uniform teams, skewed, tilted, and balanced. So in uniform groups, all members shared the same external diversity status. So they all basically are in the same in-group, or they all kind of feel like they look the same. So skewed groups have between 1 and 15% of one particular minority, and that's one of the things that Dan mentioned earlier. And then tilted groups are about 15 to 35%, and then balanced groups are between 35 and 65%. And actually the skewed groups have the most issues because people feel like they're the token minority. So interestingly, in another study of balanced groups, performance degraded when the majority also felt threatened. So perceptions of competition and power threats led to increased hostility and discrimination, which basically goes back to that point that actually inclusion is incredibly important in terms of diversity, not just diversity by yourself. So creating a happy team then, going back to that New York Times article that I mentioned on Google's mission to basically codify the secrets of high-performing teams. So they had performed this over about 3-year period, and they collected a huge amount of data. And they had, statisticians, organizational psychologists, sociologists, engineers, and all sorts of researchers actually working on this. And they came up with 2 major things that they actually identified as creating high-performing teams. The first one of these was when they actually studied teams, so they observed all of these behaviors on teams, and 2 things actually stood out. So they didn't find any particular patterns in the structure of the group, but they found that teams where every member of the team spoke an equal amount, in team meetings or over the course of a week, or had an equal opportunity to speak, those teams did really well. And the second one was where team members actually could read each other's body language and understood kind of social clues within the team. So for example, a team member would know that one of the people on his team was having a bad day or an off day, or if the team were trying to work together on a particular problem and somebody wasn't speaking up, they would know, for instance, that they didn't agree and would encourage them to speak up. So being able to read body language cues and actually having an equal distribution of discussion were the 2 major things that they actually assigned to high-performing teams, which is very interesting because both of those things fall under the idea of psychological safety. And so psychological safety is key for inclusiveness. So diverse teams don't work by themselves unless you have psychological safety and inclusion within the teams. So how do you actually set that up though? Because it's all well and good to say, okay, I've got a diverse team, I've got 3 women and 7 men on this team, I think it's all going to work, we're going to, be rolling in the cash now that, or we know that high performing teams actually are good for business. So building that culture of empathy and trust and respect and safety can be really difficult, and it doesn't happen overnight. And so this is why, one of the things that we try and do within Gumtree is to actually build that into the teams regardless of whether or not they are diverse teams. The idea being that, if you have that culture of inclusion and psychological safety already within the team, it's more likely that you will attract other diverse individuals into the team. So one of the best ways to build this kind of safe zone, high-performing team is to basically give, especially new teams, lots of time and opportunity to discuss some of these topics and talk to each other, which might seem a little bit counterintuitive when you're an engineering team and all your engineers are saying, we just need to be coding, we don't want to be sitting around talking to each other. So it's very difficult to get engineers to actually sit together and talk about how they're feeling. So one of the things that we did at Gumtree was to actually get the teams to work together on a team manifesto. And so the team manifesto just meant that there were a couple of topics that they had to talk about and agree on. So what is our team goal? What are we trying to achieve? What are the values that we have? What do we think is valuable for us as a team? And what are the behaviors that we agree are acceptable and unacceptable for this team? And that's a great way to get a team to actually form together, particularly if it's a new team. And that helps to drive that discussion and feeling of safety within the team. Creating a team that can read and accurately that can accurately read nonverbal clues is a little bit more difficult. Some people are just really good at that, and I think when you see particularly new leaders really excel, it can often come down to this kind of innate ability to be able to read how people are feeling. But I'm a firm believer that it's a skill that can be learned. It just needs to have some practice, patience, and persistence. So there are a few other things, though, that you can do to keep your team happy. Shared goals and vision is another clear thing that the Google team took away. So having that shared goal and vision can actually help, no matter what your team makeup is, to help them bridge whatever diverse values that they might actually have. One of the other learnings from one of the studies that I looked at was this idea of building bridges and coalitions, especially if you've got teams where there might only be one or two minority divergent thinkers on the team. And so what they found is that if you're working in a team and somebody has a minority opinion, it's very easy for the team to dismiss that opinion as, just being an outlier. But actually, if you form kind of alliances within the team, so for example, your team lead could back up the person with the minority opinion, even if they don't necessarily believe that that's the case. But just to have two dissenting voices in the team instead of one can lead the whole team to re-examine the facts. And so that's what can potentially lead to better outcomes, because everyone has re-examined the facts. So that's just kind of a tip that you can take for your own teams. Okay, the other key takeaway is that one thing that we talked about earlier, which was that performance is not easily recognized from outside of your own group. So we talk about in-groups and out-groups. In-group is everyone who kind of looks like you, and out-group is everyone else. And so studies have shown that you are far more likely to recognize performance in your own in-group. And so that comes down to recruitment, promotions, all that kind of thing. If you want to actually have, in particular, women in your senior leadership teams and in senior positions, then the people who are making those decisions need to also be within that in-group. So that's why it's critical to have women in senior leadership positions if you want to actually continue to grow your diverse talent. Okay, so I'm going to kind of skip on a little bit here and just go to one last point. Whenever I'm interviewing candidates at Gumtree, so when I joined, we had the leadership team at Gumtree is 50-50 male-female. My leadership team within technology is 50-50 male-female. But within our engineering teams, our percentage was much lower, female to male. So I think it was about 22%, kind of similar to what you're seeing. And the week I joined, I was asked to hire 10 developers. So that's quite a lot of developers to join the team. So we kind of made a concerted effort to change and adjust our recruitment process. And in the end, we ended up hiring 40% female, which was awesome. We're still not overall at the percentage that we want to be, but it just showed that if we put that concerted effort in, we can actually make a difference in our hiring process. One of the questions that I ask all my candidates, because at eBay we have values, and I do kind of a culture interview with every candidate, and we go through the values that eBay has, and one of them is being richly diverse. So a lot of people get this question wrong. And it's not that there's any right or wrong answer, but it gives you an indication straight away if somebody actually tolerates diversity or embraces it. And so for leaders, I ask the really tricky question is, what do you think the disadvantage of diversity is? And a lot of people tend to trip up on this because they've all been told that diversity is a really positive thing, and so they think it's a trick question. But the answer that I'm looking for, and the thing that comes up again and again and again, is communication is way harder in a diverse team than it is in a homogenous one. And I laugh because I gave a similar talk at the CTO summit last year, and I think 99% of the people at the summit were white males. And I happened to sit down beside the only other Irish white woman in the room. And so we kind of turned to each other and went, oh, where are you from? Oh, where are you from? And why are you here? And blah, blah, blah. And within 15 minutes, we had exchanged a humongous amount of information between the two of us because we only had to speak in half sentences. I had never spoken to this woman before in my life. So that's what happens in homogeneous teams when you've got your in-group. You can speak in half sentences. You have those cultural references. You even body language, everything. So it's very easy to have a conversation, but it's a little bit trickier when you've got diverse teams. Okay, so I'm hoping that I've given you a few tips and you at least understand why inclusion is very important when it comes to diversity, that it's not just diversity by itself. So it's about promoting that culture of inclusiveness and diversity of thought across the entire organization. As leaders in technology, it's kind of up to us now. It's not a HR thing to actually move the needle on this. So it seems a bit of a cruel irony that within the tech industry, which is so dependent on divergent thinking, that the people who can actually deliver that divergent thinking are not at the table. So thank you.
So now I will actually ask my director and a colleague to bring up some chairs to the stage so we could have more of an interactive discussion with each other. I definitely urge everybody to participate, ask questions not only to the speakers but to the people around the room of what issues you have in, what successes you had, and just participate. We have our mic for all of you who attended the Facebook event last quarter. You're pretty familiar with it. Just throw it into the audience if you want to ask a question. Speak into the cube. Is it working? Yeah. Well, when it's on, please ask questions. And I just wanted you to give another round of applause to both Roisin and Dan for delivering some awesome presentations today.
Roisin?
Mm-hmm.
Good. Okay, cool.
Roisin.
Okay, cool. So my question is, have you ever felt that you've been under pressure to work harder as a woman in an industry where it's mainly men? Because I know, even if I just look at today for an example, I don't know whether it's true or not, but a number of women were going to come, but maybe they haven't, and they feel more pressure because they're like, I need to do more than men. Is that something that you've...
I don't think I ever felt an pressure to do more over and above my male colleagues, but I probably had pressure to prove myself more than some of my male colleagues, where it was kind of felt that, and actually I've seen that with a lot of women who have joined my team. And actually I agree with Dan's assessment as well, that what you end up finding is that the women who do stick it out are really, really awesome. And so, but it does come from this fact that you're constantly having to prove yourself. I feel once you get to a level of, CTO, that kind of drops off a bit, which is good. I don't feel that same pressure. But certainly as a female engineer in a team, you do kind of feel that need to actually prove yourself. But I think there is an interesting thing that happens that goes the other way as well. I don't know if anybody has experienced being in an all-male team and having a female join the team and how that changes the dynamic a little bit. And so I've had experience over the years where there's this thing that keeps happening. Maybe it's just in Ireland, I don't know, but the swear jar comes out. And so there's this feeling that everybody needs to behave themselves a little bit more or something. And then they realize that I'm Irish and I curse like and so, but yeah, it does happen as well.
Talk to the box or?
Right. If I could ask a question, diversity could be different things or different way. Here? Yeah. Like this? Is it working? Can you guys hear? Okay. All right. So diversity could be different things, right? So as you said, race, women. So if I could put an example, people coming from overseas, right? Different color, different looks. So how that's different, how much of that diversity comes into play or into even discussion, that's one thing. And students who coming out of uni with no experience, right? So they expect, you see the jokes that, kids with 20 years experience want a entry-level experience to get into jobs. So how much of that's getting the visibility at this type of discussions and how people are genuinely addressing those areas, right? So are we just talking about people who based here, born here, or we are opening up? Are we thinking about all those at the moment? Just something came to my mind.
So that's why I think it's important to separate the two, diversity and inclusion, because I think the diversity thing regularly comes up as a HR kind of initiative. And so HR need numbers that are measurable, and so they tend to focus on one particular area. So for example, at Gumtree, HR are focused on gender diversity in tech and age. And so from an inclusion perspective, though, the same methods that you employ to have inclusive teams cover all aspects of diversity. So if you're actually managing your teams to actually promote that culture of inclusiveness within the teams, then that will apply to all those three different categories of diversity that we talked about: the social, the informational, and the values diversity.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Speaking from my own personal experience, this is such a broad topic. There's so many different avenues to explore, and so I guess the area that I've started to develop an understanding of, I'm by no means an expert, but something that I've worked hard to try to understand is gender diversity. But that's not to say that other forms of diversity are any less important. Like they're all incredibly important. And I think when you're talking about inclusion, that can apply to so many different people in so many different ways. So as an example, I had a guy that worked for me a number of years ago, who was in my team, and the group the whole team had organised a lunch. It was at those like Brazilian I think churrascos, when they've got the big grills and they're carving off the meat and everything. And I said to one guy, he was Pakistani, he'd been living in Australia for a couple of years, I was a Muslim, and I said, can you eat this stuff? You need you prefer halal food, right? He goes, yeah, but that's okay. They can go on. I'll just get a sandwich. It broke my heart when he said that, because I felt like nobody else in the team had even considered whether that was a question they should ask, right? And so the next time they made sure that they found an option that he could be a part of. So I think it's it's just a matter of understanding how. You don't necessarily need to have complete empathy with everybody's situation. That's really hard to do. But just be aware that not everybody thinks the same way that you do. Not everybody has the same desires, needs, requirements as you do, and try to identify how the different folks on your team fit into those. Yeah.
Hi. I've got two questions now, actually. I'm going to be greedy. I had one, but now I've got two after that point. There'll be more. So on that point there, how much onus do you think there is on the... By the way, this is really weird, isn't it? A bit odd speaking into a box. How much onus is there on the person who is the minority, let's say, to speak up, like in a situation like that, for example? I guess as a hiring manager or as a boss, you need to foster a culture where people feel they're able to, the inclusive thing, so where they feel they're able to speak up and say. But how much onus is on the actual person?
That's another interesting one. Sorry, do you mind if I jump into that one? Sorry. This is kind of illustrating my point in a weird way. I started this, I'm still pretty ignorant, like I'm still pretty dumb when it comes to these kinds of things, but I was a lot dumber a couple of years ago. And I started asking women about this stuff, like about feminism and all the rest of it. And I remember one particular occasion, there was a woman who got quite upset with me, and I couldn't for the life of me understand why. I'm like, I'm trying to help. Why are you getting upset at me? And she explained to me this concept of cognitive load. So even though I'm trying to help and trying to understand the issues, I'm expecting her and other women like her to do cognitive labor, like mental effort, to help me understand. And that was it. It was a tricky concept for me to grasp at the time. I think I'm starting to get it now, but I think it applies in lots of other ways. So I think, to answer your question, really there's very little onus. I think ideally there should be very little onus, if even no onus, on a minority in a team to take on that responsibility. It's putting cognitive load onto them. So to take that to a natural extension, I think it's up to the team to make an effort.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Do you want to add anything to that, Roisin?
I do agree. I think also, just doing what you were saying and actually being, vulnerable and available as a leader, and just to say, look, I don't know all the right ways of doing things, and I've been hit with this similar thing before. Like when I was working in Australia years ago, we had been very successful in a project that we were working on, and so I knew that a lot of the team didn't actually drink, and so I didn't want to do the very Irish thing and take everyone to the pub afterward. So we said, right, we'll go and have a lunch. And it was in the middle of Ramadan. So we got to this lunch and half the people there weren't actually eating, but nobody had said anything. So I took that away and kind of went, okay, I am never doing that again. I'm going to actually double check before, I do things like that. And then I joined Gumtree and was very excited because we'd managed to hire 10 new people, and so wanted to take everyone out for lunch. So I set up a couple of dates and whatever, and had one of the guys come back in the team and said, do you know that's in the middle of Ramadan? I went, oh, shit, really? So you have to actually, I was delighted that he came to me and said, do you know you've messed this up? But to be able to actually just be a little bit vulnerable with your team as a leader and accessible and say, look, help me out. I think that's, nobody expects you to be able to understand and know everything.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to, the next question, because Sanya wants to go as well. On your point, actually, Roisin, when you said about, was it the dictionary definition of inclusion, which was being inclusive in spite of your diversity? Was that? Or in spite of your differences?
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
So, I actually don't agree with that. I disagree with the dictionary. It's probably written by white men, to be fair. I really think that the definition should be more about inclusion is about being inclusive despite your differences, not in spite of them.
I think the actual definition was in spite of or because of your differences. So,
yeah, right.
But yes, I agree. Yeah.
So it should almost be a moot point. It shouldn't even be a thing. But we all know that Australia is a little bit behind the times in that way as well. It's fairly casually racist over here. I think it's fair to say. Had a wine. So what do you think we can do as we're obviously, we're expats as well. What can we all do as a community to change that in Australia and help foster a different culture in that way for the future?
That's not a small question.
No, sorry. It's a bit loaded, isn't it?
Yeah. So I can tell you one of the things that, I guess, just from what's within my control, I guess. As a leader within technology, I work with my team on various different things, but then also one of the things that I was surprised when I came here was that there wasn't kind of a group or community for senior technology leaders, female senior technology leaders. So I set up a meetup group, and we're launching in May. But for me, it's just kind of being aware and trying to do things that are within my control. And I think within the technology industry, there's probably more within your control than you even kind of realize, and it's just kind of having that awareness and being mindful about some of the decisions that you make.
I think from my perspective, it's probably, I mean, everyone's going to have, I guess, a different way that they can contribute to this. I look at what I personally can do. I think, I mean, the work that I do alongside my team at Expert360 to try and change that has been powerful, but I think more so is probably helping men in particular realize that they might want to change their behavior. I think probably, I imagine this is true in Ireland and the UK as well, but Australian men often feel this pressure to be manly and to not necessarily be sympathetic to certain perspectives or groups. That somehow takes away from their manhood. Or if you're down at the pub and one of the guys you're with is behaving really inappropriately, a lot of men would really struggle to call them out on that because they would stick out like a sore thumb, right? Yeah. So I think it's not easy for men to kind of instigate change like that, but I think one of the roles that I'm at least trying to play is help more men feel comfortable or confident in calling things out. So I think that's one of the very specific things that I can do. Yeah.
So I actually have a point to add to your first question, Alicia, and then I have my question to you guys. So on the point of how you can make sure that you understand how the minority is feeling, I don't know if you remember how I met, was actually one of the attendants of the Men Champion and Change Den, and in his company, he just implements a simple system that every morning on a stand-up meeting, they just do the I'm glad, I'm sad, I'm mad system. So basically, every person says, I'm glad because today is a short day and we finish at 4:30. I'm sad because it's the end of summer, and I'm mad because Dave from accounts just made that racist joke yesterday and it made me feel uncomfortable. So what it instantly makes people think is that they can openly share their opinions and their concerns, and probably my example is a bit too extreme, but excuse me, I'm Russian, so I pretty much have no filter and my boss has to deal with it on a daily basis. But basically, I think it's a very simple way of understanding how your team feels from pretty much first hour of when you come to the workplace, because if somebody actually has any issues or concerns, they will speak up because it will be normal and it will be a daily routine, and it won't be something that they will have to grab their manager and pull them into a room and say, hey, I was really uncomfortable that this happened, because they will be able to openly share that. And my question would be probably quite a standard recruitment question, because that's something that we have to deal with on a daily basis. For example, I've been recruiting and development for almost 3 years now, and one of the most popular questions that I get from a lot of people that I work with is, oh, can you find us a woman? And they don't really care about the skill set. They don't really care about what this person can actually bring for the team. They said, well, we're really struggling on diversity, and it's particularly true for bigger organizations. And they say, we really need a woman. If you submit any candidates to us, please submit women. And I would be really offended if I was hired to any of the organizations I used to work with and I'm working at now, if I was just a woman and they hired me just to boost up their diversity numbers. I want to be hired because I have my experience and my expertise. So how would you educate and coach people on the fact that, yes, diversity is great and inclusion is great, but if you go on the route of positive discrimination, it just pretty much ruins the whole concept of it?
That's a tricky one.
It is a tricky one. I think if a company does that, they're taking the lazy way out. I think to actually enforce it like that just means they're trying to push the problem onto something else. And so it means they don't have to worry about generating that inclusive environment and doing the work that's required to actually hire more women. One of the things that I'm trying to do kind of within, so Gumtree is part of the eBay Classifieds group, and it's a multinational thing, and I'm trying to kind of, because people are interested in the fact that, now in my new hires, I've got 40% women in technical roles, except one of them left and went and worked for Dan.
I'm sorry. She's awesome though.
Anyway, but one of the things that we do is that we don't send out the same, put the same job spec up in the same places and expect a different result. We have to actually change how we recruit in order to change the numbers. And so we host a lot of women in tech events. We had one today in the office, which was a workshop for women who code. We get our names out there. We go and do talks like this, talk at different events. We advertise the fact that we are looking for people at women in tech events, and we advertise on women in tech forums. So you have to be a lot more proactive. And in fact, a lot of the women who actually came to work for us, including Claire, actually came through referrals. So from people, so we lean on our networks a lot more. So that's, if somebody says, as a company, we're going to request that, 50% of our people are female or whatever through the hiring process, it's not going to work, because that's just the lazy way out. It's not going to work.
Yeah, I think it just shows that folks that do that don't actually understand the problem. They're saying, oh, we should hire a woman because we're supposed to hire a woman because we're supposed to hire a woman. It's like something they think that they should do, without really understanding, well, why are we trying to improve the diversity of our workforce? So I think to attempt to answer your question, it probably comes from helping people that ask that sort of thing to understand, firstly, why are diverse teams important, but secondly, also help them understand that it doesn't take away from a meritocracy. You still should hire the best person for the role. I would never advocate against that. You shouldn't hire somebody just because of their race, gender, religion, whatever. But you do need to make sure that you change the way that you present yourself, change the hiring processes and so forth, so that more people have an opportunity to be put forward. So for me, it's just an education thing. I don't know, that's probably a cop-out answer, but it's because they don't understand the reason they're doing it.
You'd be surprised how many companies do that. People bring those things to say that. So
I know from like an eBay Gumtree perspective, like we do have, we require the recruiters that we work with to have the same, like processes when it comes to hiring, so that they are taking gender diversity into account. So if any of the recruiters we were working with were only sending us males, that would be a problem. So, we do push that back on the recruiters quite a bit as well, to make sure that they are hiring for diversity too, or that they're sending us candidates with a diverse background.
Oh, sorry. Look, firstly, thank you, Roisin and Dan, for sharing your time. And you look really passionate with this topic. You're actually embodying it, so that's coming through to us. I'm not sure whether it's only your teams or where it is in your company that you've got this passion and the culture from. What can companies do, and where does it need to start or filter through in the company for this to actually happen? So is it CEOs, team leads, or just your team, and how can a company and where can a company get into this?
So I guess we work in two very different companies. Yours is quite small and mine is, like, eBay is significantly huge. And so it definitely has to come from the top down. And so we recently, about 12 months ago maybe, hired a chief diversity officer in eBay, Damien Hooper-Campbell, and he came and kind of did a bit of a world tour. And so came to our office and had, very frank conversation with everyone on the floor. It was actually, he came the week after the Google Manifesto incident, which was very topical. It was quite interesting. He's an African-American male. I don't think he had ever anticipated the level of frank and openness that it can happen in Australia. So I think it was a bit of a shock to him, the ferocity of the discussion. But I think having that come from the very top and have people at every level know that it's part of part of their job. So this week we had regularly we have director level and above meetings, and this week the meeting, 50% of the meeting was put across to diversity discussion. And so the group CTO for eBay Classifieds Group is actually the diversity champion for ECG. So it's at all levels of the organization, and if I didn't feel like I had that support at all levels within the organization, it would be much more difficult for me to kind of put in some of the more aggressive tactics that I need to actually get the results that we need. So from my perspective, it needs to be top down.
I agree. I mean, yes, we are from very different companies, but it's the same answer. Although the interesting situation with Expert360, our team I think is about 70, so it's minuscule compared to eBay. But our CEO is a woman, first-time CEO, and she's obviously very supportive of diversity and this issue generally. But the interesting thing about that is because she's a founder, CEO, woman in tech, Sydney startup, she's kind of a rare breed. There aren't many people like her in Sydney, sadly. And so she actually gets asked all the time by the press, by events to do things like this. And that actually takes her ability away to be successful in her role as a CEO of a startup. So it's an interesting conundrum. So the discussion that we've had actually is that she's sort of the spokesperson for the topic across the board, but she needs lots of support from her team, and I try to give her as much support as I can, which is one of the reasons why I do what I do, because I think it's unfair to put all of that load onto to women CEOs, for example. So, yeah.
So question from, not for you, but based on what you were saying, you were talking about making your interview process very uniform and asking the same questions for every candidate you interview. Do you allow yourself the ability to, like, maybe ask a standard set of questions but divert to get the best out of somebody that may not fit into a standard question set or what have you?
Yeah, I'm not a robot. So
yeah.
I don't just sit there and read them questions and then write down the answers. I think what makes a good interviewer is being able to take a set of questions and weave them into the conversation and make sure that you're getting the right answers out. I mean, it's the same whether you're interviewing a person for a role or interviewing somebody for, I don't know, for a documentary, for example. Like, you've got to be able to dig into the particular things you want to ask without just sitting there and reading from a sheet. I think that's actually that's the skill. Yeah. Yeah.
We've only got time for one more question. So Paul, I'll leave it up to you whether you want to choose male or female.
Who?
Because I work for Precision, so you go.
You sure?
Yeah, go on, it's fine.
It's fine.
It's not even a huge question.
Precision have held down the question.
All right, sure. Thanks, you guys. Roisin, you in your talk you mentioned that when you have a diverse team, one of the not negatives, but one of the challenges is that communication can be reduced, so you're not as effective in communicating. What sort of practical things do you employ to improve that communication across a diverse team?
Great question. So I think one of the things is just recognizing, first of all, that communication is a little bit more tricky. So with our teams, it's getting that acknowledgement and so first of all, active listening is a big one. So you're not passively kind of assuming or making assumptions. So it's active listening, not making the assumptions, and then kind of feedback and acknowledging that you've actually understood. So that seems very clunky, but when you're actually in a team and you get into a process of doing this, then it starts to become more kind of second nature. But yeah, at the beginning it's a little bit difficult. But actually what you find is that, so certainly within our teams anyway, they get used to working with each other, and so they develop their own kind of norms in terms of communication, and so it becomes much easier over time. They kind of develop their own ways of.
Is it always just time? Like, is there anything that you do to kind of speed up?
Yeah, talking to each other a lot at the beginning, like when you form new teams, which I know I mentioned you get a lot of pushback from engineers because they just want to be developing, but actually talking to each other at the beginning can make everything else kind of go a lot more smoothly. So giving your team reasons to get together at the beginning and sit around talking to each other, and even if it's just, you know, take them away for a day and do fun activities together, and that's a great way of letting them get to know each other.
Oh dear, it's down to me. I just wanted to add on to the, I do have a question, but I just wanted to add on to the interview process. I know at Precision Sourcing we definitely have, like for someone who's going to come and work as a recruiter, we have such a mixed interview process, and the same as at Gumtree. I was actually coordinated all the interviews when Roisin was hired at Gumtree. So, but we have such a diverse interview process. So it's not only just the, you know, the leadership team there's many, but you have like a cultural, you know, interview as well, and to meet as many people in the team as possible, just to, you know, ensure that it doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman. It's, you know, how your personality and your capabilities like fit within the job. So it really doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman, it's how your energy blends with the team. So
can I add to that as well? Because
yes.
You've just reminded me that when we were going through the process of hiring last year, we were kind of reviewing our process as we went, and what we found was that when female candidates came through, they were far more likely to ask if they could meet with the developer and speak to them or do a floor walk. And they were things that we hadn't actually done before. It wasn't part of our process, so now we do it with everyone. So it's kind of not just sticking to a specific thing, it's getting feedback from candidates as well and adjusting your process.
that's awesome.
Apparently there was, just to round that out, not a personal experience I had, but the head of diversity and inclusion at Atlassian made some changes to that process. They would actually do floor walks. It was one of the things that they would do for interviewing candidates. But they would go past the beer fridge, the ping pong table, you know, all of the.
But we
all
take
of
our
that.
people out for a drink.
Right. Yeah. Well, they changed it so that they would go past, the lounges and the creche and, you know, other things that sort of didn't fit into that sort of traditional sort of Silicon Valley thing, and their rate to final interview for women increased significantly.
Quickly, I just wanted to make a few points before we all go to the pub. So first of all, I just wanted to thank our speakers for delivering those types of talks and actually interacted with audience. So please give them a round of applause. I also wanted to thank you all guys, because it's a Friday afternoon and let's be realistic, most of your colleagues and your friends are probably now at the pub having their third, fourth beer of the day. And I think that topics like this are really important, and it's really important to create awareness and to discuss them at different levels, not only at the senior levels, and just start and discussing it. Just as a quick example that I wanted to give to you, I actually came to Australia from Russia, if you haven't figured out by my accent yet. When I was studying in high school, I had programming classes and we were starting to code in Pascal. We have very outdated Russian school, but basically I was really struggling to understand what I was doing, because as much as I love technology, I'm not a coder and I probably don't have the talent for it, but I really tried to understand it, and I still remember my teacher telling me, oh, you probably don't need it. You're going to become an economist or just get married and have kids. You don't really need to know that. And a few of my friends had the same experience, which pretty much absolutely discouraged them from pursuing a career in technology. So I don't know how many of you have daughters or little sisters, cousins, friends who are just considering to pursue a career in IT, but I would definitely encourage you to just speak to them, explain to them how exciting it can be, how interesting it can be, and never tell them that they can't do it because they're just not worthy or they're just not talented or it's not something that their gender has historically been doing. So thank you very much, guys, for being here. Please continue the discussion in the pub afterwards. Please continue the discussion out there. We're going to share some content because Freelancer has brilliantly filmed the event. So we will be sharing some content with you after the event. We will be send in a questionnaire after the event as well. So please give us some feedback in terms of how we're hosting the event, what topics do you want to discuss at the next ones, and the particular question about the timings as well. I know it's a bit of an unusual one because usually it's Thursday 6 p.m. that all of the meetups are hosted, so we will really appreciate your input on that. What would be the best time for you to attend those events? So thank you very much. Give yourselves a round of applause. Which pub?